All right. Welcome back to class for another week. I hope everyone's doing well. I hope everybody's reading is going well with Hayes and Pennington. Lots of great stuff between those two texts. Once again, the Hayes book, if you really get a hold of that one and internalize it, it will help you lifelong as a reader of the Gospels, really the New Testament as a whole. So make sure you're doing your reading. Please let me know if you need anything or if I can be of any help to you. Today we will be working on, I know the syllabus says historical Jesus this week for our sort of topical lecture, but we will be doing Christology in the Gospels instead. So sort of an audible there. We're going to go this direction instead this week. So Christology in the Gospels. So when we talk about Christology in the Gospels, what are we talking about? If you are doing systematic theology, um, the word Christology might mean something, you could be talking about that's very broad. The two natures of Christ, you could be talking about a whole bunch of different things. When we talk about Christology in New Testament studies, and in particular the study of the Gospels, probably the main question we're asking is how do the New Testament authors view Jesus' relationship to God? So you've got, our Orthodox creeds and confessions. Jesus is God in form, all of this wonderful stuff. But New Testament studies, these sort of historical critical scholars, um, they sometimes read the New Testament texts and they would say, purely trying to describe what the New Testament author believes, that this author does not believe anything like what we would know as later Orthodox Christology. So a very common example, we'll talk about this more in a minute. Some scholars of the Synoptic Gospels, and especially the Gospel of Mark, would say Mark does not think that Jesus is a divine being. They would say Jesus is a great prophet, he's a great teacher, healer, wonder worker, all that, but he's not divine, at least not in any sense that he is the embodiment of God. Maybe John thinks that, but these scholars would say, Mark doesn't think that, Matthew might not think that, Luke probably a little more in an Orthodox direction. And I'm super simplifying this here, but that is a debate within New Testament scholarship. Who do the New Testament authors think that Jesus is? So to back that up, let's see how do we get there? Um, in the last 200 or 300 years of New Testament scholarship, critical study of the Bible coming out of the Enlightenment, um, uh, we begin that era with when we look at the Gospels, scholars look at the Gospels, they're very interested in what the Gospels can tell us about the historical Jesus. So if you remember this from New Testament introduction, there's this quest for the historical Jesus, multiple quests. Um, but the underlying assumption in the historical Jesus stuff is that there is a difference between the Jesus of history and the Jesus of faith. So the Jesus of history is um, the historical figure who walked around in the first century. Um, and the Jesus of faith is the Jesus of our creeds and confessions. And historical Jesus scholars, sort of the underlying assumption under historical Jesus studies is that those are two different things. There might be similarities, but the Jesus of faith and the Jesus of history are ultimately two different figures. The Gospels can help us in thinking about both of those things, but in thinking about the historical Jesus, um, they would say there's historical information within the Gospels, but they might not consider the Gospels, fully reliable or accurate or whatever. So, famously, plenty of New Testament scholars, historical Jesus scholars, um, do not believe that Jesus was the Son of God. They don't believe in the resurrection. They don't believe in many of Jesus's miracles. You get historical Jesus scholars, famously talking about Jesus walking on the water. Well, maybe the disciples thought he was walking on the water, but there was a sandbar there or something like that. Um, the whole criteria for historical Jesus studies, I think, is questionable. We won't get into that too much today, but they're using the Gospels, these accounts of Jesus' life, as windows into the historical Jesus by which they can sort of dissect which parts of the Gospels are, real historical information and which one that is later charisma, dogma from the church being projected back on to Jesus. So in the early 20th century, a scholar named Albert Schweitzer writes a book. The German title is Von Reimaris zu Vrede. In English, the title is The Quest for the Historical Jesus. The German title means From Reimaris to Vrede. And what he's doing there is he's tracing the history of Jesus research from Samuel Hermann Reimaris, really kicks off the historical Jesus studies thing. And I believe the story goes is that I'm going to get my names mixed up here. His son-in-law, whose last name was Lessing, after Reimaris's death, found these writings uh, sort of about Jesus and based on the Gospels, trying to figure out what was historical, what was not. These end up getting published after his death. That wouldn't have gone over well during his lifetime. And from there, scholars start thinking more seriously about the Jesus of faith versus the Jesus of history. All the way up until 1907, I believe, Wilhelm Wrede, you can see that name at the end of those parentheses. You can also see it on the third bullet point. Writes Das Messias-Geheimnis in den Evangelien. The Messianic Secret is how we translate that into English. And he's, thinking about this Messianic secret motif, particularly in the Gospel of Mark. But Schweitzer writes this book, Von Reimaris zu Vrede, and he's tracing the history from Reimaris to Vrede. And Schweitzer looks at the last, century and a half or whatever, however long it had been, of historical Jesus research, and he offers a pretty scathing critique of historical Jesus research. He essentially says that these scholars of the historical Jesus, they look down into the well of history and they ultimately see themselves looking back. So the Jesus that these scholars reconstruct end up looking a lot like the scholars themselves. So these sort of post-Enlightenment modernist, revisions of the historical Jesus. Whatever values Schweitzer is saying, when these scholars look back down in the well of history and look for the historical Jesus, whatever values they hold closely is what they tend to see and draw out in the life of Jesus. Very serious critique. He's really criticizing their historical method and work. Schweitzer himself, fascinating figure. He ended up being a medical missionary, I think to South Africa or somewhere in Africa. I think he won a Nobel Peace Prize. I believe he was also a very talented musician, a wonderful philanthropist. He ultimately, didn't affirm any orthodox theological stuff that we would say. He was a scholar of the historical Jesus. he views Jesus of Nazareth, from what he can regather through the Gospels. Um, uh, Famously, he talks about Jesus at the cross when he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He wouldn't affirm the resurrection. He would say Jesus um, really believed he was ushering in the reign of God until the cross. He has this epiphany that his God is not going to save him. And Jesus is crushed by the wheels of history, Schweitzer would say. Um, Interesting stuff. Historical Jesus studies dominated gospel scholarship through the 19th and very early 20th century. Um, you get things like form criticism, Formgeschichte, the German term, source criticism, redaction criticism. These are sort of critical tools that scholars use to um, pick through the layers of the gospel texts as we have them. You learned about these in New Testament introduction. Um, but redaction criticism, for example, focuses on the gospel authors as redactors of their tradition. So, say Mark is the first of the four gospels. When Matthew, for example, uses something from Mark, how does he change his material? Um, and what does he mean to do by the way he changes it? You can tell a lot by what Matthew thinks by how he alters the material he receives. So those are important critical tools. Vrede, his messianic secret at the beginning of the 20th century, does mark sort of a turning point in gospel scholarship. So whereas historical Jesus had really dominated the field to that point, Vrede starts asking sort of different questions of the Gospels, particularly Mark. Um, he asks, uh, we've got this motif in Mark, this very fascinating motif where whenever Jesus heals somebody, he tells them to be quiet and don't tell anyone about it. For some reason, only the demons really know who Jesus is in Mark, and he silences them whenever they say it. The disciples are portrayed very negatively. They don't have a clue who Jesus is in the Gospel of Mark. Even when Peter has his confession in chapter 8, um, he then very apparently doesn't understand who Jesus is, rebuking Jesus, telling him he shouldn't suffer, that whole deal. And Jesus calls him Satan. Um, and Vrede looks at that and he's trying to understand theologically and literarily what purpose does this serve for Mark as an author. Um, so think about, form criticism and source criticism. Um, how did the text take the form that it's in? Source criticism, where based on oral tradition or prior written tradition, where are the evangelists getting their material? Vrede isn't quite as concerned with those questions. He's asking, based on the shapes that the narrative takes, um, uh, Mark is not just a compiler of tradition. He's not just sort of taking this tradition here from the oral tradition and this tradition here from a written tradition, and then jumbling them all together into this, somewhat coherent story. Uh, he's thinking of the gospel authors as theologians, as narrative writers who are interested in putting together something of coherent narrative, which is sort of radical in gospel studies at the time. Now we've had within literary criticism the rise of narrative criticism, and this has made its way into New Testament studies. So this is not controversial anymore in the same way it would have been 100 years ago. But Vrede starts asking these questions to try to understand literary purposes of the gospel writers. And from then, that really does open the door for the rest of the 20th century and even into now for scholars to those lines with. Um, as far as the Christologies of the Gospels, and you'll notice I'm using the word Christologies plural. Um, on one level, I could say the Christology singular of the Gospels, and that's well and good and true. Um, on the other hand, and I do think the Gospel authors are in agreement about what they say about Jesus, but they have different ways of saying it, and I think it's important for us to highlight each of their voices and take time to think about what each evangelist is interested in highlighting for their literary and theological purposes. Um, we have these sorts of Christological trajectories, scholars would say. You can think about this chronologically. If we think Mark was written first, then Matthew and Luke in some order, probably Matthew, then Luke, and then John is late, much later than the other Gospels, maybe in the 90s or something. Some scholars will put him much later. They would say you can draw a trajectory. It might not be totally linear, um, but Mark is early, and uh, as such, he has very primitive Christology, a low view of Jesus, and the trajectory is upward. Scholars would say, until we get to Nicaea or Constantinople or Chalcedon or whatever. Um, the trajectory of Christology is upward. So uh, Bart Ehrman wrote a book, How Jesus Became God. How Jesus Became God is the title. And he's very much doing this. How do we get from the Jesus of the first century all the way to these elevated divine claims of Jesus? And he would say we can trace sort of a Christological trajectory. Mark has a lower view of Jesus. Matthew and Luke have an elevated view from Mark. John has a much higher view of Jesus than the synoptics, and so on, and we can sort of draw that. Um, there are problems with that. Uh, for one, the Gospels are after Paul as far as when they were written. Of course, the events of the Gospels happened before the events, or before Paul's letters. The Gospels are very hard to date, and tons of debate over that. I take a view Mark as the earliest is probably 65, give or take. Matthew, maybe in the early 70s. Luke, maybe in the mid to late 70s. John, maybe somewhere around 90. I'm flexible on all of those. It's very difficult to defend any of those. But they would say um, Mark, for example, or we can work backwards. John, think of John's prologue. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Later in John, I and the Father are one. Um, John 10 with the Good Shepherd bit. Who is the shepherd of Israel in the Old Testament? It's God himself. Think of, I believe, Ezekiel describes God that way. Um, and Jesus says, I am the Good Shepherd. Um, John very explicitly has a very high view of Jesus in relation to Israel's God. Um, John's Jesus is Israel's God in the flesh. Work backwards, though. It's not nearly as explicit in something like the Gospel of Mark. I think it's very clearly still true, but plenty of scholars, as we'll see in a second, do not take that view. But the point about Paul, the problem with that sort of trajectory is that Paul predates the Gospels. Um, so Paul is writing something like Galatians or Romans or Philippians before Mark writes his story. In Paul, I mean, think of the Christ hymn in Philippians chapter 2, um, especially the end there where he's quoting from Isaiah 45, this bit about Jesus receives the name above every name at which every knee will bow on heaven and on earth or under the earth. Well, if you go read Isaiah, he's very clearly talking about the divine name, Yahweh. Jesus receives the divine name, and he is described very explicitly in Yahweh terms. 1 Corinthians 8 as well. Paul sort of remixes the Shema, but includes Jesus in there in a way that's this excessively high view of Jesus. So the idea that the later Gospels would have a lower view of Jesus, I think is problematic in that it would still need to develop after Mark to get a divine Jesus. I think you get a divine Jesus very, very early in Paul. Um, and it's difficult to think of linear progression as if it would go back down. Um, Obviously, there's tons of Christian communities where we don't have any historical evidence from them in the first century. Our writing sample is very, very small. Um, it's not as if every Christian thought what Paul thought in the first century. Clearly, within his own letters, he's fighting with people theologically all the time. Um, and so there's one sense in which our view of early Christian theology is very limited in what we have access to. But I think that trajectory bit is misguided because Paul sort of throws a wrench in that. So how do we get from the historical Jesus to Christian orthodoxy? Something expressed in one of the creeds. Um, the Gospels are one piece of that story. They're not the only piece. Christology, in the way New Testament scholars talk about it, is on sort of a spectrum. There is high Christology and there is low Christology. We've already touched on this a bit. And there is early high Christology and early low Christology. So a scholar like Bacchum the earliest Christology as the disciples of the apostles are trying to make sense of Jesus post-resurrection. They already have views that Jesus is in some mysterious way, which doesn't get totally worked out for a while, but the core of it is there, that Jesus is in some strange way the God of Israel, visiting his people, coming to them to make good on his promises from the Old Testament. And again, John versus the Synoptics, I've hinted at this. Many scholars would say John shows a much later, higher Christology than the Synoptic Gospels. And because of that, we can see that sort of trajectory. I would personally say, and I think we'll find in Hayes's book, Hayes has a brilliant bit at the end of the chapter on Mark, his Mark section, those last few pages about how Mark can say things cryptically that John might say very explicitly. Just because Mark doesn't communicate in the same way as John doesn't mean he's not saying a lot of the same things. And I think we should pay a lot of attention to that. So even though Mark doesn't come out and say something like Jesus is God, think of the opening citation of Isaiah in the Gospel of Mark. The beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, just as it's written in the prophet Isaiah. And of course, he quotes Malachi and Exodus as well. Behold, I am sending my messenger before you who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, from Isaiah 40. Make straight his paths. This is clearly in the narrative going to be referring to John and Jesus. John is the voice in the wilderness who prepares the way of the Lord, Jesus. Well, if you go back to Isaiah and read the Hebrew text, Lord there is very clearly the divine name, the Tetragrammaton, Yahweh. And I think Mark is very aware of that. He's very aware of what he's doing. When he says prepare the way of the Lord, he is saying prepare the way for Yahweh's arrival. And who is it who arrives? Jesus. Jesus is not just another messenger like John preparing the way for the Lord. The Lord's arrival in Mark is Jesus's arrival. So, whether you hear this on the History Channel or Twitter or wherever, this pitting John's Christology against that of the Synoptics, that's silly. I don't think that's good scholarship. That is poor work. Um, so let's run through a few proposals of this um, sort of these Christological configurations. How do scholars talk about Christology in the Gospels? What theories have they put forward? First, and this is particularly in the Synoptics, Hellenistic Greek traditions have this. Scholars, 80 or 100 years ago, would talk about divine man traditions or theos on air. These sort of characters in Greek literature and Greek narrative who are like semi-divine figures. Um, so Philostratus, the biographer, a couple hundred years after Jesus in the third century, will write about a guy who's a rough contemporary with Jesus, living in the first century, Apollonius of Tyana. And he is an exorcist. He's a miracle worker. This sort of itinerant uh, sage, itinerant. Got that word right. One of those words you don't say very often. But he travels around and does things. And uh, Philostratus describes him as being divine multiple times. He's a divine figure, not in the sense that he is God, um, and he's working with multiple gods, but he is sort of a divine being in a category we don't have great categories for that in Christian theology. Um, Scholars have since criticized that, and they've said this theos and air divine man proposal that this is how an author like Mark views Jesus. He's not Israel's God, but he is this sort of like divine figure in a way that Greek authors sometimes talk about people. And scholars have criticized that because the divine man category in Greek literature doesn't actually hold up as strong as you would think. The category itself is sort of problematic. It's just not as much of a category as it was proposed earlier. Another option, Jesus is a man who's possessed by the Holy Spirit. So at his baptism, I think in particular, I don't remember if I talked about this in the lecture. Whereas uh, Matthew and Luke, in both of their chapter fours, at the baptism of Jesus, have the Holy Spirit coming down upon Jesus, the Greek preposition epi. Mark has the Holy Spirit coming ace Jesus to, or sometimes into Jesus. Um, some good work has been done on this. Some scholars will take this to show the Spirit is possessing Jesus at his baptism, according to Mark. And I don't think this holds water at all, but one of the arguments they would make is that at Jesus's crucifixion in Mark, he breathes out his last, he expires. Um, and the Greek word for breathing out his last is ekpnuo, like to breathe out. And just as he receives the pneuma, the Spirit, he breathed out the pneuma, the Spirit, at his death. So they would say he gets possessed as baptism. The Spirit leaves him at his crucifixion. That's a difficult argument to sustain. I don't think that holds any water. But this is one way that people talk about um, Jesus and the Spirit in the Synoptic Gospels. Jesus is a normal guy who receives the Spirit. He's possessed by the Holy Spirit at his baptism. That explains his ability to perform miracles, to perform exorcisms. And they would draw on texts like Isaiah 42 and Isaiah 61, where the Spirit of the Lord, the servant of the Lord is anointed with the Spirit, and it um, sort of enables the Lord's servant to, in Isaiah 60, 61, to bring good news to the poor and to proclaim release to captives, all of that sort of thing. And they would say that's conceptually mapping onto the Gospels in order for Jesus to be empowered by the Spirit in a way that he wasn't before his baptism, something like that. There are problems there with both how they're reading Isaiah and the Gospels. I would just say that doesn't quite hold water. A third way, this is primarily in a book by scholar J.R. Daniel Kirk. He wrote a book called A Man Attested by God. I think it came out in 2016. And it won the Book of the Year for the Society of Biblical Literature at the time. And he has this category in Second Temple Judaism of the idealized human figure. Um, and an idealized human figure, he kind of, through reading a whole bunch of Second Temple Jewish texts and the Hebrew Bible, constructs the category, tries to synthesize it all into a category called idealized human figure. And an idealized human figure is somebody, usually some legendary figure of history, who in later literature reaches this sort of divine status, or even sometimes within the Old Testament. So, he points to in Exodus 7, um, God talks to Moses, and the Hebrew construction uses the Laman preposition. You will be, I think it's Lelohim, like as a god to Pharaoh. Um, it's a very strange passage. Um, when Philo writes about Moses, Philo, the first century Jewish uh, historian, um, he very much sees Moses as a divine, godlike figure. Um, I think Philo has stuff about Moses creating the world, excessively high view of Moses. Melchizedek, that strange figure from what is it, Genesis 18, very strange priest figure where Israel doesn't even exist yet, or the Levitical priesthood doesn't exist. Um, Melchizedek traditions are fascinating. He gets mentioned again in Psalm 110. You will be a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Hebrews has a fun time with Melchizedek. The Qumran community, where the Dead Sea Scrolls came from, they have 11Q13, a document also called 11Q Melchizedek, where Melchizedek bears the divine name. He is called Yahweh, and he is described as a divine figure. Different figures like this, Kirk would argue, there are categories within Second Temple Judaism to talk about figures as very like encroaching on the divine identity. They're not Yahweh, they're not Israel's God, but they're coming very close to it. And Kirk would look at Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels, and he would say that's the same category that the authors of the Gospels are using. He would also look back to Genesis 1 and 2, that humans are the image of God and they're supposed to be God's representatives on earth, and Jesus is just doing that in the fullest sense as the new Adam, that whole deal. But I won't go into everything Kirk says. But for example, that text in Mark 2, where Jesus heals the paralytic and forgives his sins, the one who's brought by four friends on a mat. And then the scribes and Pharisees, they're grumbling. They'll say, who can forgive sins except the one God? After Jesus pronounces forgiveness of sins. And Jesus answers, well, uh, what's more difficult, to say your sins are forgiven or to say arise, walk? But so that you will know that the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins on the earth. And then Jesus says, get up and walk, and the paralytic is healed, and he takes his mat, that whole deal. Kirk would look at that story. You and I might hear, Jesus there is making a divine claim because he too can forgive sins, and he proves it in a sense by doing his healing as well. And who can forgive sins except the one God? And that's a good It's actually a good question. And the answer is nobody, and Jesus is included within the divine identity there. Kirk would read that passage and he would say, no, actually, an idealized human figure can also forgive sins. And Jesus does not say, look, I am God. He says, so that you will know that the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins on the earth. Arise and walk. And so he would say, Jesus there is not claiming to be God. He's claiming to be the Son of Man, the God's, divinely authorized agent. Um, Kirk as well, his argument doesn't hold water. It's a big, like 600-page book. He's a good writer. I think his categories don't hold. As we continue to go through Mark, I'll be pointing out his arguments and why they just don't work. Um, uh, for many reasons, that's too much to get into now. I just think that's not very good work. If you want to read something, in response to him or sort of alternative views, go read Richard Bauckham, Jesus and the God of Israel, um, and his essays on Christology, early Christology. I think those are really helpful. Larry Hurtado is another good figure to read. Um, So that's the idealized human figure. Another one I'll briefly mention, Jesus the magician. A scholar named Morton Smith wrote a book called Jesus the Magician. And he talks about Jesus's miracles in the Gospels and compares them with ancient magic practices. It's an interesting book. Ultimately, it's scholars don't give it much attention anymore. It's sort of run its course. Plenty of problems with that approach. He's drawing comparisons that aren't actually there. Finally, divine identity, Christology. So this is where we would say early Christology is high Christology. The Christology of the Gospels, they present a Jesus who is Jesus as the embodiment of Israel's God, come to make good on his promises from the Old Testament. So we talked about the prologue of Mark. Hayes will talk about in Mark chapter 6, where the disciples are on the boat and Jesus walks on the water. And then he makes this little comment, Mark does, Matthew takes it out. Jesus intended to pass them by. He intended to pass them by, like to pass by them without being noticed. And Hayes will point to Job 9, where Job is praying after he's lost everything. And he's praying about God, and he says he intends to pass me by. And he says that in his lament. And Hayes will argue, look, Mark is very much casting Jesus in this Yahweh role. By the way, Mark uses the Old Testament. Whether we see it somewhere as explicitly as these certain texts in the Gospel of John, Dr. Chrysler Anderson has done really good work on Christology. I've got one of his books. This is, if you can see this, Echoes of Lament and the Christology of Luke. Really great book. How Luke uses the Old Testament, but particularly Old Testament lament. People lament to Jesus in the Gospels, like people in the Old Testament lament only to Yahweh. And Jesus laments, which Dr. Christ. One argument that he makes, which I think is just really great, and he has a separate article published on this as well, is Luke has the example of the thief on the cross turning to Jesus at his death and crying out, Lord, remember me when you enter into your kingdom. Remember me. And Dr. Chrysler has a great bit about divine remembrance. And even how on ancient inscriptions of tombstones, a Jewish prayer could be, "Remember me, God." Um, and so even there, Luke is hinting at this. The thief on the cross is, by asking Jesus to remember him in his kingdom, he's praying something that you would only pray to God. So that sort of work is really helpful. That's all over the Gospels. The logic of the Gospels, I think, only works if Jesus is actually Yahweh come to deliver his people. All right, so that's going to wrap up our discussion on Christology. There is much more that could be said there, but we will have to leave it there for now. Um, let me see how to get back to this. There we go. All right, so Christology is extremely important for our reading of the Gospels. If you go and work in a church, you might have people say, "I heard this on TikTok or whatever, that the Bible doesn't claim Jesus is God, or Jesus never claims to be God in the Gospels." And being able to talk about that and be aware of the conversations around that is very important. And Christology in the Gospels is essentially that's what we're aiming for when we do that. So keep working hard, keep staying up on your reading. This work is very important. The Gospels are a sort of canon within a canon, um, essential to everything we do for ministry and for the Lord. And if you want to know Jesus closely, you need to read the Gospels. There's no way around that. And hopefully, through our work here together, we can continue to read the Gospels more and more responsibly and interpret them accurately. So, thanks for all of your hard work. Your labor is not in vain. Keep it up this week. Let me know if you need anything.